Welcome to The Explainer. Let's get right into it, because today we are unpacking one of the most absolute, mind-bending geopolitical and cultural transformations in human history. We're talking about Indonesia, but we aren't just looking at the modern nation we know today. We are going to trace the massive historical changes that completely overhauled its demographics, its geography, and its very identity. I mean, how exactly did an archipelago of thousands of islands, once ruled by countless local sultans and kings, morph into the unified modern nation-state sitting on our maps right now? To really get it, we have to look at the powerful outside forces, some pretty wild historical paradoxes, and the colonial legacy that aggressively rewrote the region's entire trajectory. So grab a seat and focus in, because the story of how Indonesia became Indonesia is absolutely fascinating.
So let's start with a really basic question. It's a name you've probably heard and used countless times, but I want you to really think about it for a second. Why is it called Indonesia? For a massive archipelago situated in Southeast Asia with this incredibly rich, ancient culture, where exactly did this name come from? Was it an ancient local term? A title bestowed by its original inhabitants? Well, the answer to this actually kicks off our whole journey of understanding just how much of modern geopolitics is completely inherited from the outside.
And this perfectly illustrates our first major shift. The name Indonesia is not originally local at all. It's actually derived from the Greek words Indos and Nasos, which essentially translates to the Indian Islands. But how did it get that name? Well, it stems from European explorers, specifically the Spanish and Portuguese, who were desperately sailing around the globe looking for a direct route to India for the spice trade. When they stumbled upon these islands, they essentially labeled them the Indies, or the Indian Islands. Now, conversely, long before these Europeans even arrived, Arab and Islamic traders had entirely different, much older regional names for this area. They called it things like the Islands of the East, or used specific names for local kingdoms. Yet, it's the European-imposed name, born literally out of a navigational misunderstanding, that somehow stuck and became the official identity of the modern nation.
But the name was just the beginning. When you look at the timeline of the region, you can really see how relentless waves of outside influence forced massive changes across the archipelago. In the 1500s, you had the initial arrival of the Portuguese and Spanish, who were trying to bypass the Middle East to get their hands on valuable spices. Then, by the 1600s, they were largely pushed out by a new dominant force, the Dutch, specifically the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch held influence there for over 300 years, completely upending the local power structures. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you have the Japanese occupation starting in the early 1940s, though the imperial buildup really started in the 30s, which violently interrupted Dutch rule. And finally, after the dust of World War II settled, the region fought for and declared its independence in 1947. Every single one of these eras brought foundational changes to the region.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. A profound historical paradox happened during the Dutch colonial period. When the Dutch arrived, they were primarily interested in trade, which meant they focused heavily on occupying the coastal regions and controlling the ports. But this coastal occupation had a massive, completely unintended consequence. The local Muslim populations and traders, basically wanting nothing to do with heavy-handed Dutch colonial rule and taxation on the coasts, were forced to pack up and migrate inland. And this forced migration inadvertently caused a massive demographic and religious shift. As coastal Muslims moved deep into the interior of the islands, they interacted with populations that were largely following animist or pagan traditions at the time. The religion ended up spreading like wildfire through these inland networks. By the time the colonial era was winding down, this dynamic had fundamentally transformed the religious makeup of the archipelago, eventually bringing the population to a peak of nearly 98% Muslim. That's before more modern demographic shifts and missionary work brought that number to where it sits today. But think about that. The Dutch push for coastal commerce accidentally catalyzed the creation of the largest Muslim majority population in the world.
We really have to talk about how the Dutch were ruling too, because it kind of challenges everything we think we know about history. For centuries, Indonesia wasn't ruled by the Dutch government. It was ruled by a corporation. This is the concept of corporate rule. We're talking about the Dutch East India Company, a private, profit-seeking joint stock company. Imagine a modern mega corporation today, but equipped with its own massive navy, private armies, and the legal right from its home country to wage war, negotiate treaties, and conquer territory. The profound transformations in Indonesia during this era weren't driven by a traditional state. They were driven by a board of directors looking at profit margins. To give you an idea of just how powerful this model was, consider this staggering number. At their absolute peak, these European corporate entities, like the Dutch East India Company in Indonesia and the British East India Company in India, independently controlled roughly 60% of the entire Islamic world's territories. Actually, let me repeat that. 60%. This wasn't state-to-state conquest in the traditional sense. This was corporate acquisition on a global, heavily militarized scale. It completely redefined the economic and political structure of the region, transforming organic, self-sustaining local economies into purely export-driven resource extraction machines for European shareholders. Which brings us right into the post-colonial era, and a question that is absolutely vital to understanding modern geopolitics: who actually drew the lines on the map? When you look at a map of modern Southeast Asia, you see distinct borders separating Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines. But did these borders exist before the colonial companies arrived? The short answer is no. See, if you look at the people living in this region today, you find deep organic cultural ties. People living on the island of Borneo, for instance, share similar ethnic backgrounds, similar climates, and variations of the exact same languages. Yet today, they are divided into entirely different modern nations. Part of the island is Indonesia, part is Malaysia, and a tiny sliver is the independent nation of Brunei. Why? Well, because hundreds of years ago, British and Dutch colonial forces negotiated a line on a map to divide their commercial territories. When these nations gained independence, they didn't revert back to their ancient organic borders. They just inherited the artificial boundaries drawn by the colonizers. And they didn't just inherit borders either. They inherited an entirely foreign concept of what a state actually is. Following independence, Indonesia adopted the European nation-state model. This is a concept that was born way back in Europe in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. It dictates that a nation must have a strictly defined physical territory with hard borders, a homogeneous people, a unified common language, and absolute state sovereignty over that specific land. Before colonialism, the region operated on entirely different systems of loyalty and governance, often based on shared religious identity, tribal affiliations, or shifting sultanates that didn't care at all about hard lines on a map. By adopting the nation-state model after independence, Indonesia fundamentally transformed its political DNA to match a European template. And this created a profound paradox upon independence. As we established earlier, the population of Indonesia was overwhelmingly Muslim, upwards of 90%. Yet when forming this new modern nation-state, the founders chose to adopt a fundamentally secular government structure. Instead of forming a state strictly based on religious law, which might have aligned with the demographic majority, they chose a system heavily influenced by the secular nature of the modern European nation-state model they were inheriting. It's a huge choice that really highlights the tension between the organic demographics of the people and the inherited political systems of the modern world. This tension between the organic and the inherited even trickled all the way down to the very language people use to communicate. Let's look at Bahasa Indonesia, the national language. For centuries, the Malay languages spoken in the region were written using an adapted Arabic script known as Jawi. This was deeply tied to their Islamic identity and those historical trade networks we talked about. However, as part of the massive cultural change and colonial legacy, the script was formally shifted to the Latin alphabet. Yup, the exact same alphabet used by the Dutch colonizers. So today, even when a citizen is speaking their native local language, they are writing it using the alphabet of the West. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to think about. How much of modern national identity is organic, and how much of it is just inherited? From the very name Indonesia, to the borders that define it on a map, to the secular state model that governs it, all the way down to the Latin letters used to write its language, so much of what makes up the modern state was left behind by outsiders. Yet inside those borders is this rich, vibrant, locally driven culture that has adapted and completely thrived. It really makes you look at a globe differently, doesn't it? The lines and names aren't just geography, they're the living legacy of historical changes. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the map.